All right, as you know, we started the book of Ruth last week simply because the very first verse of the very first chapter says, in the days of the judges, that's when this story took place, this event took place. And so since we just finished the judges, that seemed to be a natural progression of what to study. We studied this on Wednesday night back in late 2020, early 2021. So those of you who are here are going to recognize this as a repeat of that. And we're not going to just spend all of our time on it because we've been through it recently, but at least take a look at it. Maybe even more importantly, because Judges was such a dark, ugly, terrible book, and the story of Ruth is such a beautiful, touching, tender book. As we said, if Judges left a bad taste in your mouth, Ruth is the breath meant to make that better. And so that's another reason why we're going to look at that. This is what we talked about last week. We talked about the introductory material and all kind of the background stuff about that. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. So that's where we cut off last week in our discussion. We talked about where Moab was. We showed a map of where Moab was on the other side of the Dead Sea from Israel. It's not far away. In fact, as we mentioned last week, you can see it from the west side of the Dead Sea. You can see it on the east side of the Dead Sea without any magnification aid whatsoever. But that's where they went because evidently there was food there. We talked about the fact that there's not a mention of famine in the book of Judges per se. And several commentators have their ideas as to when this took place. Some of them, or a small majority of them, I would say, seem to think it was during the time of the Midianites and Gideon when they were raiding and destroying food supplies, that maybe that was when it was. But again, we don't know. There was famine. They left to go to Moab, and that's where all of these events took place. So we go to Moab. Elimelech dies. Mahlon dies. Chilion dies. And Ruth and her 2 daughters-in-law are left there by themselves. So, what would you say the loss has been up to this point? Well, the husband and sons, that's obvious. That's the given. And so, we know that the husbands and sons had died, and so they're gone. That's out of the picture. What did that mean for Ruth and her daughters-in-law in that culture? Dave, and then Erwin. Elvin, I'm sorry.
If Naomi had stayed in Bethlehem, she would have had kin there.
Okay.
About she didn't have any kin.
Yeah. So she has no income. Okay. Let me go ahead and put the rest of this up. Maybe she's lost her vision for the future. What do I do now? Her vision of the future was with her husband, with her 2 sons, with the daughters-in-law. She was probably already bouncing grandbabies on her knee in her mind, even though they didn't have them at that point. So she lost her vision for the future. Ellen, you had a comment?
Yeah, it was basically the same thing. Women in those days had women and their husband to take care of them. Yeah. And that made them part of that family group who would take care of them even if their husband was to pass.
Yeah.
So I think that she, after living with her for 10 years and with them, she started to understand Naomi and her reasoning and everything. And that's why later she says, I'm going to go with you because you're making the right decision.
Okay. So she's got the loss. She's there by herself and all of that. Jim.
I don't know. I guess I need to learn more. But can women actually have property at that time?
Okay. Quick answer to that is no. Not really. Yes, during the conquest of the Canaan, some women were given plots of ground, so it's possible, but that was in Israel. We're talking about Moab here. And so I'm guessing that since she's not a native of Moab, what rights and privileges does she have? Probably none whatsoever. So she's lost her husband and son. She's lost her vision for the future. And, you know, every night when Naomi was getting ready to go to bed, what was she doing? Praying. I think she was worried about the future, wondering what was going to happen. I would. You would probably if you were in that situation. That would be what your natural response would be. And so she's probably dreaming up all of these things that could happen or couldn't happen. We tend to do that, don't we? We play through every scenario, no matter how outlandish it might seem, trying to figure out what to do. And most of the things we worry about don't ever come true, but sometimes they do. Dave?
Well, you know, as we get on into the story, we find out that there was lots of people who stayed in Bethlehem, stayed in Israel, and they did fine.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the conclusion is that Naomi and her husband probably made a rash decision.
Maybe so. Yeah, made the wrong decision about moving. But before we criticize them too hard, what was the possibility of staying? Starving to death. And so, I mean, I understand why they moved. Was that the right choice? We asked the question, were they maybe their faith in God not what it should have been, that He would take care of them? Those are questions we can't answer because the text doesn't tell us. But some of the potential and perceived losses, she's probably thinking she's lost her daughters. And we know that because what's she going to tell them to do? Go home to your mother's house, go back to your gods. That's what she's... So in her mind, she's already, for some reason, worked that out. And that potential or perceived loss that she's about to experience, I mean, she's been with these girls for at least 10 years and longer. So they have a loving relationship. It's not just a passing thing. And so she's going to lose that. And at least in her mind, she's going to lose that because she's going to leave them behind with their mothers rather than taking them with her. She's probably thinking that she's lost the potential for a heritage for her husband's name. Because under the Levirate system marriage that was in the old law, if Elimelech had a brother, he could have taken her, had children with her, the lineage would have survived. But notice Naomi's wording in verses 11 and 12. But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to have a husband," she says. "If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." So Naomi kind of answers that question for us and how she's perceiving it. She's saying, I'm too old to get married again. I'm too old to have kids. Kids for my daughters-in-law, that's just not on the table. That's not an option. And if there's no kids through any other source, then there's a threat to the heritage, at least the land heritage for her husband. And could we say she might have questioned her faith? Yeah. Verse 13. "No, my daughters," this is the second half of the verse, "for it grieves me very much for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." So who's she blaming for this? It sounds like she's blaming herself and the Lord. Now, whether she feels it was justified or whatever, we don't know. But she's saying, okay, the Lord is the one who's doing this to me. The Lord is the one who's caused this. And so those are just her losses, her perceived losses in this circumstances. That's what she's dealing with in her mind right now, trying to decide, what am I going to do? How am I going to survive? And of course, you all know the story. She decides to go home, which is always probably a good thing. Go back to people you know, people that love you, people that can care for you, people who are the same nationality as you are, people of the same belief system that you have. And so that's what she's going to eventually decide to do. But until she gets to that point, and again, I would like to know, and the text doesn't tell us, how long from the time Mahlon and Chilion died until she actually went back. Was it a month? Was it a year? just don't know. There's no way, the text doesn't tell us. We know that she says the daughters helped her with the dead, so they did whatever they had to do for the burying of the dead there. And however long that took, whatever procedures were in place at that point in time. So we don't know how long it took before she finally made this exchange. Both Mahlon and Chilion died, so the woman survived, and her two sons and her husbands. Then, verse 6. How much time between the last death and the beginning of verse 6? The narrative just goes boom, 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 point to point to point to point, without any nod to any type of chronology. So how much time passed between the last death and the beginning of verse 6? Don't know. Some, obviously, time passes. So we don't know how long it was, if she waited a year, if she waited a month, if she waited 6 months. Simply don't know what the answer to that question is. Why this question? In verse that we just asked, how long did Naomi have to think about her loss and her perceived and potential loss? Sometimes the longer you think about something, what's the natural tendency of how our minds work? It spirals out of control, doesn't it? Generally, if we're thinking about problems, our thought processes don't get better, do they? They tend to go the other direction. And so again, I don't know how long Naomi had to deal with this, how long it took her to make her decisions, but every day she spent waiting was probably a day she got a little darker, a little more gloomy, a little more frustrated, a little more unsure about everything, simply because as a woman in that day and time, even in Israel, it was difficult, but much more so in the land of Moab, which didn't have the same laws and somewhat elevated status for women that the people of Israel would have had. Well,
it would be easy for us to question our faith.
Sure.
But when we struggle and have difficult things in our lives, we lose loved ones, our faith is always tested. And we wonder, where's my faith? And I think that's the situation. She's desperate, but still self-questioning God.
Yeah, and that brings up a point, and I'll Dave and then Janelle in a second. When she says the Lord's hand has gone out against me, does that necessarily mean she's lost her faith? No. But she's questioning, and we should never question God, should we?
No. Is she not?
Okay, is she?
But is she? I don't see that she is.
Okay.
I see in a lot of times, especially in the Old Testament, they just simply say, well, God has said no to me on this one, but they're still following God and going after it.
So her statement here is not necessarily a lack of faith. It may be a questioning of faith. It may be struggling with that faith. But it's not necessarily, we can't just throw her under the bus and say, well, forget Naomi, she's given up on God, which she hasn't. If she'd given up on God, she probably wouldn't have gone home to be with her people. That's where she knew she needed to go back to her people and God. Dave, you had a comment?
Well, I just wanted to say, my earlier comment was not to say that she questioned her faith or that she had a lack of faith. Sometimes we make decisions and then the consequences and outcomes of those decisions are unforeseen.
Mm-hmm.
And she looks back and says, well, the Lord has blessed the people back home, and then she's got two sons that have disobeyed God and married Moabite women. So they did not live, they did not respond to their upbringing. And so, she could have these decisions weighing on her. It's not necessarily that she didn't believe in God, or she thought God was, she might have thought God was punishing her because of the bad decisions, but which of us haven't also thought the same thing? I don't think she was not thinking for.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point I was headed towards. Just because I question why something's happening, just because I even wonder, God, what are you doing, doesn't mean my faith is bad or I've lost it. It's just the natural response to everything. How many times did Moses go to God and say, what's going on? I don't get it. And it wasn't that he was doubting God, he just didn't understand. And he wanted clarification. He wanted to know, what's God doing? What are you doing through this, God? I need to know this. And so when I go through life, and when you go through life, and sometimes there are those days when you just say, I just don't know. don't automatically beat yourself up that you've lost your faith. It's natural for us to question. Janelle, you were next.
Maybe not a loss of faith as much as facing a reality.
Okay.
All these things that happen, these deaths, the people aren't coming back. They're gone. So she's having to face some reality of things. And maybe a little sidestep. Sometimes the more we think about problems, the bigger they get.
Yeah.
And this is a big problem. So she's working on it. And the decision that she made to go home was good enough for her. So she says, okay, if I can go home, maybe these daughter-in-laws can go home as well. And things will work out for them too. So she's trying to take care of who's left and let go of who's gone.
Yeah, absolutely. Redemption, you got a comment?
I was just going to say, we had a similar experience. In November 94, Glenn's mother passed away. In February 95, my oldest brother passed away. In June, my oldest sister passed away. So we're just 3 right in a row. You don't question God, but you are sad. And yet you don't question Him at all. And you don't lose your faith, but it's hard.
Yeah.
It's very difficult.
Yeah, and I think that's the point I'd like for us to make. Yeah, sometimes life is hard. And if I start then questioning my faith because life is hard, that's just going to add, as you said, the problem just gets bigger the more you think about it. And so, yes, we have the right to question and to doubt and to wonder and to worry. That's all right. As long as we don't give up on the fact that God is still large and in charge and loves us and knows what's best for us. I think Robin was next. I got a bunch of hands up back there.
I just think that she was just stating a fact that she thought in her mind, stating a fact at the time.
Yeah, she was stating her circumstances as she saw them, not turning her back on God. But this is the way it is. I lost my sons. I lost my husband. Don't know what I'm going to do. Bob?
Well, being kind of the matriarch of the family, she felt responsible for women. And I think she's unsure whether she can even take care of herself, let alone help support 3 of them. You know, making this journey to, she's going back to family.
Yeah.
But they've got, you know, the other 2 really have nothing. At least in the first city.
Yeah. Let me go ahead and put this up. What other issues might have weighed on her heavily during this time? I think some would be income, housing, 3, vulnerable women. Because they were more vulnerable than they would have been in our circumstances. So you gotta. This is all possibly what's going through Naomi's mind right now. Amy?
I find it interesting that she said go to your mother's house instead of father's house.
Yeah.
Especially since men were the ones that were in control of society, and the women not much rights and property and so forth.
Yeah, and several of the commentators pick up on that and try to figure out why she used that term versus to your father's house. And it's all speculation. They have write a lot of stuff about it, so we won't go into that. But it's interesting. She says to her, back to your mother's house rather than your father's house. Glenn had a comment, and then Marcia.
Don't you think, Ruth, we're kind of like this, always looking for that greener, the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. And sometimes we get ourselves in trouble looking for that.
Yeah. The grass is greener over the septic tank, they say. And if you've ever heard that, we used to say it in Oklahoma because the town I grew up in had septic tanks. It's beautiful. Stretch of grass in your backyard. The rest of it might be dead. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Who was next? Marcia was next.
Oh, I was just going to saying go to your mother's house, probably because the mothers were the caregivers.
Okay, sure.
Not the income part of it, but the caregivers, which is what they needed.
Yeah. Go home to your mom so she can take care of you and take care of your needs. Noah?
Not only that, she said, go to your gods.
Yeah. And
I think this is an important part we hear because we have to look at God's point of view. She's been with this one, Ruth's been with this woman all this time. She's watched her faith, watched her believe, watched her struggles, watched her pray. And those are the things that are important because love, which God gives us, was definitely evident in Ruth. she loved Naomi. She wanted to be with her. She wanted to be with their people, their God, her God. And I think this is one of the most important lessons for us, because as we live our lives, we have to remember that God is supposed to be our number one. No matter what we do, and when we make mistakes, who do we turn to? God. And if we believe in Him, if we don't, then we go down a path of, like we said, depression and all this stuff. So I find it hard to believe that Naomi herself was really worried about her situation. Put your faith and trust in God. Everything will turn out fine. It's just going to be right.
Okay? Well,
Applying it to our lives, God tests our faith for a reason. But He also says just that He won't test us any more than we can handle.
Right. And so, He's not going to destroy us. He may make it hard for us, but He's not going to destroy us. Mark.
Yeah, I was just thinking, we really, really need these Old Testament stories, because so many times the Old Testament gets put away, it's old history, it's hard to read sometimes. But as you look at the New Testament, it's this struggle of Christ trying to institute His doctrine, and so many of the Old Testament are stories of real life for people. And you know, if you try to base your life upon the accomplishments of what happened in the New Testament, you look at Paul and a lot of these people, and you go, I don't have a chance. It's too high a bar. But if you look at the struggles of the people in the Old Testament, these real life stories, they're a lot more relatable, and you can see how they reacted to these things and how God took care of them.
Sure.
So it's quite a contrast, but I think a lot of times the Old Testament gets overlooked, and it has oftentimes has the more real life application.
Sure. Yeah. Here's an actual illustrative story to go with that of what happened. This is the assumption that I'm going to throw out there. If it was a poor decision to leave Israel and go to Moab, and now she's coming back after all that's happened, isn't there a story in the New Testament called the parable that kind of says the very same thing? Prodigal son went to a far country. Of course, he didn't live like he was supposed to, so it's different. It's not the same story. But again, this is the story, as we said when we started this. Our title of our study is a message of hope and redemption. They've gone away from home. Now she's coming back home. We go away from God. The message is, go back home. Come back home. It was like in the parable, the father's waiting, looking down the street every day, longing to see you coming. And so, again, you take those, as Mark said, take those Old Testament stories, and they give us real-life illustrations of how some of these New Testament doctrines and ideas played out even before Jesus ever walked the face of the earth. Because God wanted redemption for His people even before Jesus was on the scene and in the picture. So, it's again, the Bible's an interesting and wonderful book, and I think it's important for us to remember all these things. We're not going to make too much hard, fast application from that comparison with the prodigal son, but I think it's worthy to at least keep that in the forefront of our mind, that she went home, and that's where help came from, that's where healing came from, that's where Obed came from, Jesse came from, David came from, Jesus came from. All of that from her going back home. And so I love this story. I love everything about it in the sense that it teaches so much. Dave?
Well, yeah, I think it's one step further. All that came from her leaving Israel to go to Moab in the first place, which, and from her retrospect, she might have saw that as a bad decision, but look what happened.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, she
if
if it was a poor decision on her part, and she looks back on it and realizes what's happened, then it's a message of, okay, I didn't do that quite well. Maybe I need to backtrack and rethink how I make those decisions. But
did she really have a choice about leaving?
Okay, yeah, and
she had to go with her husband.
Yeah.
So we can't blame her for leaving.
And that's the interesting thing about this story. We can draw these conclusions, but we need to be very careful not to just say, well, they made a bad choice, dismiss them for doing that.
Her husband wouldn't make the choice.
The husband made the choice. How many of us make bad choices? And if I get dismissed for every one of my bad choices, well, I'd be dismissed all the time. And so would you probably. And so it's not, yes, learn from the narrative not to make bad choices, but at the same time, once we do, there's always a way back from that bad choice if we're willing to do what's necessary. Amy?
Is there any foolproof way not to make bad choices? I mean, besides some of the obvious,
Die.
Don't walk across the
Die. If you die, you will cease to make bad choices.
Okay.
That's I don't know how else to fix that. Flo, you have a comment?
It was economic.
Yeah.
Talk about the man and the housing, the income. There was a big family.
Yeah.
You had to move. And sometimes we as families, husbands and wives, make decisions that are economic, and nothing to do with anything else.
Right. And I can see you got famine in the land, there is no food. Famines get worse until they get better. And so, you're thinking about my kids starving. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna make some drastic choices in that to make sure that they have food. And so that's all part of that issue as well. Mike and then Bob.
There's a parallel situation to this. Jacob went to Egypt because there was a famine in the land. While in Egypt, God started developing his plan for Abraham and for them to return at a convenient time. I don't know, I see a parallel there.
Yeah.
Something like Elimelech and Naomi, they didn't go to Egypt, they went to a place where they could find food, just as Israel did. And certain things happened there, but God worked it out where they were able to go back home, and his scheme of redemption was all being developed in both cases through their going away and then returning.
Yeah, and it's when you back away from the details of the book of Ruth or the book of Judges or the book of Joshua, and you look at that bigger picture. I mean, Jacob going to Egypt, and then Joseph being sent to Egypt, and all that saved them from famine. Same kind of thing at that point in time. Years later, all because God was able to work through even the bad choices his people made. If in truth this was a bad choice, and we're not saying that it is, but even if I make bad choices, God can still work with that. If he didn't do that, then the story of the prodigal son wouldn't even be there. He used that awful choice that son made and taught us a valuable lesson about the salvation Jesus Christ offers us and makes it real for us, because I'm that prodigal son. You're that prodigal son. And we have to go home in order for us to be saved. Steve.
I was just going to say, early in Exodus, we have the story of Moses, and him trying to say, not very eloquent, wanting to give up on every turn on God. He got to even the point where God was actually going to kill him. And had not, Eric been part of the equation. So, God's always there. His will's going to be done, whether it be through us or not.
Yeah, God's always there. God's always working. I may not be doing the right things. I may be making poor choices. But God's always there, and he's always willing, every single time, to take me back. If that's what I want. If that's what I'm willing to do. And sadly, there are a lot of people who don't. And as a result of that, they reap the consequences of that. Bill.
If you look back at the Old Testament and the New Testament, for many of the people in there, their progress involved a journey.
Mm-hmm.
From Paul back to Jesus going to Egypt, the Israelites going into the Promised Land, there was something there in the future for them that was better, or that God needed them to do, and it involved a journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just thinking about that, think back in your life. Don't offend you. 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago. is sitting in this building this morning, what you had in mind would be your position in 2023? No. I had no idea that I lived in Colorado. No idea. But, you know, the journey we take is not always the journey we think we're going to take. But we have to understand that maybe, and looking back on that, God used my life, my choices, my faith to bring me where He needed me to be, not necessarily where I thought I needed to be. And if I can look at life that way and say, okay, I'm here, nothing I can do about being here, I'm here. God, what do you want me to do here? And that's kind of got to be our attitude. And that's what Naomi's struggling with. Okay, I'm here, what do I do now? What's my choice now? And her choice is to head for home. She arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited His people by giving them bread. As a part of that decision-making process, she got news. I don't know if it was CNN or Fox or which one that she got it from. Found out Israel had food. And so that made, in her decision-making process, what do you think happened there? That light bulb went on, didn't it? Okay, my home, my people have food. What should I do? Kind of a, shall we say, a no-brainer of a decision on that one. I'll go home. There's still people there that know me, love me, that I'm related to, and I'll go home and do that. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. We're about out of time, so here's what I want you to think about. Verse 8, go home to your mom's house. Verse 7, she left the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Question 1, what do you think the daughters-in-law had in mind as to where they were going? Had they discussed this? And these are not questions we can answer, but just think about it. Had they discussed the fact that Naomi wanted them to go back to their mother's house? And if they hadn't talked about that, why did Naomi, as they're walking down the path, and it may have been, here's the left turn to go to your mama's house, here's the right turn to go to Judah, or whatever the case may be, and she all of a sudden springs this on them? Again, just kind of think about that this week, and we'll talk more about that again. Not that we have answers to those questions, but just reading through this, it almost, to me, and I'll just leave it with that, seems like this was kind of spur of the moment. She got to where she needed to do, and said, okay, go home. I'm going this way. And we'll see what the fallout is of that. All right, anything else quickly before we're done? All right, we'll pick up there, Lord willing, next week.